Good afternoon again. I'm Johannes Urpelan and I'll be moderating today's session, which is hosted by the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, our Energy Resources and Environment Program, and the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy. Today, we are very happy to welcome two terrific researchers from the University of British Columbia, Sandeep Pai and Hisham Zarifi, who are going to tell us about just transitions, renewable energy jobs, and the fossil fuel phase out. A super topical study, and so we very much look forward to this presentation. We will share the recording and the slides of this presentation after today's session on email, so all of you will receive that email. And if you are interested in finding more about our events, our work, our research, all you need to do is go to the ISEP website, which is size-isep.org. You can find our publications, recordings of all of our events, our blog, and everything on that website. And with that, I would now like to welcome Sandeep and Hisham to take control of the session. I'm going to disappear myself from your view for the presentation. I'll be back to moderate in approximately 30 minutes. Sandeep, please.
Thank you, Johannes. Thank you so much for inviting us. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. So we'll discuss just transition, renewable energy jobs, and the fossil fuel phase out. And specifically, we will discuss 4 Ws. Why is just transition important? And what kind of scale of intervention are we talking about? And what are the key elements of a just transition? And finally, there's been lots of talks about renewable energy jobs as part of just transition. So what is the role of renewable energy jobs in a just transition? So from the IPCC report released in 2018, it's very, very clear that, we need to move away from fossil fuels and reach net zero emissions by 2050. And this means that all fossil fuels needs to go or decline rapidly. And this means huge changes in energy systems, moving from coal, oil, natural gas to renewable sources like wind and solar. But one question that is really, really important in this context is what will happen to livelihoods of millions of fossil fuel workers and their community members? And so many would ask that, why should we care? Industrial declines have happened in the past, and sure, there will be some people losing jobs, but why is this topic so important? And the answer is twofold. One is a political and more of a practical answer. And the second is, from a justice point of view. So let's start with the political answer. So in the 2016 presidential election, Hillary Clinton went to a town hall meeting in Ohio, and she made this speech, which was talked about throughout her campaign. And she said, I'm the only candidate who has a policy on how to bring economic prosperity, economic opportunity using clean renewable energy as the key into coal country, because we are going to put a lot of coal miners and coal companies out of business. Right, Tim? And she wrote that in her book later, that this was one of the biggest regrets of her campaign. On the other hand, President Donald Trump, when he was campaigning, he talked about bringing coal jobs, and he continuously referred to coal miners and coal. In fact, I think he referred to them almost 298 times during his campaign. And after winning, he basically reversed a lot of pro-climate policies. Even in his speech where he decided to exit the Paris Climate Accord, he actually referred to coal miners, and he said, I happen to love the coal miners, so I can't participate. I can't let US participate in the Paris Climate Accord. So this jobs versus climate debate is not only limited to US. You see this being played out almost on a daily basis in Canada, where the politicians who support the continuation of fossil fuel industries often refer to oil jobs and coal jobs and so on. Even in Australia, like a few years ago, Scott Morrison, who was then the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, actually brought a lump of coal to the parliament, and he basically called the opposition coalophobic and said that this coalophobia will take away jobs of men and women. So that was sort of like some examples from a very political and practical angle of why, from a climate policy point of view, it's important to think about fossil fuel jobs. But at the same time, at the UNFCCC level and in the Paris Accord, there is a recognition of just transition, which basically means social and economic policies to help fossil fuel workers in their communities. It was part of the Paris Climate Accord, and it was also later. It also later came up during COP24 in Katowice in Poland, where heads of states of many countries came together and sort of declared the need for public policies or just transition policies for fossil fuel workers. So we have now established why it's important, but it's really important to show the scale of this problem. Are we talking about a few hundred workers? What are we talking about? So I thought I'll focus on India and Indian coal industry to illustrate this point of the scale of this problem. So I want to establish first that coal mining and power plant has huge, of course, impacts on climate change, but they also have large local impacts. They damage the water bodies nearby. There's lots of air pollution issues and many other issues. But at the same time, coal industry is tied to local social and economic structures. So this is a complicated diagram, but let me walk you through this. So if you look at your left, you will see how in different ways revenues and royalties are paid by coal mining and power plant industries to different levels of government, starting with Indian Railways, where they get almost 50% of their freight revenues from the coal transport, to the federal government, to the state government, and to the district level. It also, coal mining and both power plants also have people directly working and indirectly induced, and also supports informal jobs. And there are pensioners. I'll discuss this jobs aspect a bit in detail. And the last piece of this is that coal mining industry in particular is, a lot of small scale industries and, cement and large scale cement and steel industries are located in regions where coal mining is happening. And that helps them get cheaper coal to run these industries. And of course, the coal power plants provide electricity. So just to show the scale, in terms of just revenue, Coal India Limited, which is the world's largest coal mining company, alone paid about $6.6 billion in total taxes, royalties in the year 2019. And these are very important for 8 states that receive a lot of large coal mining royalties. Of course, there's lots of numerous central and districts, which is a sub jurisdiction within a state that benefits from these industries. So aside from these revenues, the other very important aspect is the social spending that these companies do. What I mean by that is that there is a district mineral fund that is used to create roads and schools and everything else. And in India, corporate social responsibility spending is kind of mandatory. 2% of your profits have to be spent on developmental projects. And so coal companies also do a lot of that. And unique to coal mining is something called welfare spending, where area managers in coal bearing areas have sort of discretionary funds to support schools, hospitals, and many other developmental projects. So this is very important for local economies in many central and eastern towns in India. In terms of jobs, we can quantify at this stage that there are almost 0.64 million people directly employed in fossil fuel industries. Now, when you add their families who are dependent, because of this, you can easily say that almost like 2 million or 2.5 million people directly benefit from coal industries, coal mining and power plant in particular in India. Then there are indirect jobs of contractors supplying explosives to the mining industry, and many such things. Induced jobs, there's hundreds of, maybe thousands of coal towns in India where coal is the dominant industry, and everything around it in terms of cafes and local tea stalls and everything benefits from coal industry workers spending and coal industry spending. And then there's something called informal jobs, which is very unique to probably emerging economies such as India, which I will explain subsequently, giving an example. Then there are pensioners, which is one set of people who are really generally ignored in this debate or discussion on just transition. In fact, in India, there are more coal mining pensioners than coal workers. So that's the scale of pensioners we're talking about. So what I mean by informal jobs is there's millions of like villagers who basically scavenge and collect coal from abandoned coal mining sites. Even kids are involved. They're just, these are coal rich areas, so you can find coal very easily. So and companies like Coal India Limited, when they abandon these sites, these villagers collect this coal, and then typically the male member of the family loads up all this coal and then travels and sells it to small scale industries, and they make a very small earning out of that. But it is really, really important for many people in these areas. And there is an estimate that about 15 million ton is produced using this kind of what we call the informal jobs. And I wanted to, so for one of my other projects, I went and spoke to many workers, and I wanted to emphasize on this quote, which really captures the current state of this debate and energy transition and what it means to workers. And I will read. The coal industry is dirty, and I am dying a slow death living here, but I have no other option. If I got the opportunity, I would love to work in the solar industry, but how will I find a job? My present is painful, but the future is uncertain, said Suresh Bhuiya, a coal worker in Jharia, India. So now we have established the why, and we have also established, the scale. But now it's important to talk about some solutions. And so we will discuss what makes an energy transition just. What are the strategies? And are job creation and destruction related in energy transitions with reference to renewable energy jobs? So we will focus on that. So to answer the first question, we looked at the key just transition strategies, and we did a paper looking at peer-reviewed literature, but we also looked at some policy literature on just transitions. And the idea was to collate different, papers, and because many scholars come from different fields and they have different ways of conceptualizing just transition and different ways of, framing the solutions. And so we wanted to look at the whole field. And we focused only on English language just transition papers. One thing I would say is that there's lots of probably papers in Spanish and German language, because just transition is a very big topic in Spain and Germany. And so we didn't look at that. We only focused on English. And the scale of focus was global, and we looked at papers in the last 20 years. And we used standard databases of Google Scholar and Web of Science. What we found is that there is a growing interest. If you look at the graph on your left, there's a growing interest on this topic post 2015. And if I were to add 2020, I would say it has passed all these papers together done in the last 5 years. Like I see new papers almost every other week on this topic. So it's a really growing topic, and many scholars have recognized that. And again, like I mentioned, there are two motivations of writing these papers. And when you read the framing, one, they're talking about the election of President Donald Trump with the support of coal communities. And second, the justice and the ethical reason why we should focus on this. And if you look at the graph on your right, you can see that most of the papers till the period we did this review focused on OECD countries, and primarily there's lots of papers in the US, understandably. There's some papers in Australia, Germany. But what is interesting is that right now this debate has not penetrated many large fossil fuel economies such as India, Middle East, Brazil, and others. So what are the 17 key strategies of just transition? I will illustrate a couple here for the lack of time. Let's start with long-term planning. So it is very, very important, scholars argue, that we need to think about this problem in a long term. We need to plan for over decades. It should start with recognizing areas that are vulnerable to decarbonization. What are the risks involved? Like, what is the scale of dependence of different areas within the country? And what are the resilience factors at play? So we have to look at this and plan in a long term and do it with at different scales and also recognize different justice forms. The other important one is I'm talking about the local jobs and diversified economies. It's really, really important to think about how fossil fuel dependent regions can diversify, because it is not possible for all workers to migrate, which is a natural tendency to think about. So it's really, really important to think about local jobs in those areas as well. And so if a just transition means more renewables and less fossil fuels, what role can renewable energy jobs play in this transition? And Hisham will take over from here and explain the rest.
Great. Thank you very much, Sandeep. Hope everybody can hear me okay. So I wanted to take a moment to also thank our collaborators on this work, Kathy Harrison, Johannes Erling, and Jessica Jewell, who have been really great in working with us. And what I'm about to present, I also have to say, at the core of it is it's Sandeep's work. To be very clear about that, this is at the core of his PhD. So I'm just a spokesperson here at this point. So as Sandeep said, if an energy transition means more renewables, less fossil fuels, and a just transition means finding new jobs for those fossil fuel workers, if we're trying to go towards a world that's well below 2 degrees C, what does that mean in terms of renewable energy jobs potential? So next slide, please. So one of the things we've been doing is thinking about what we can do with integrated assessment models to estimate future jobs. Integrated assessment models are these models you've probably seen a lot of the output from, which try to look at futures based on various sort of socioeconomic parameters and look at what happens with the energy system as well as climate change. And what we've been doing is trying to then feed a set of employment factors data into a particular integrated assessment model developed by our colleagues in Milan called the WICH model, to look at what the job impacts then are over different regions and over different time periods. So if you go to the next slide. The first thing to say is it's really hard to get jobs data. So we have managed to assemble a 50-country data set based on a wide variety of sources. Some of it's from annual reports from some of the biggest oil and coal companies that you can see there. Some of it is by reaching out to various types of trade associations, as well as the unions, as well as using the official statistics from various countries in order to produce this relatively large data set that tells us effectively for a barrel of oil, how many workers does it take in various parts of the world, for a ton of coal, how many workers does it take for various parts of the world, to run a power plant, how many workers does it take in various parts of the world. And by we, of course, I mean Sandeep did all the heavy lifting on this, and he's to be commended. And we will be releasing this data set once the paper that we're writing based on it is published. Okay, next slide. So you can see here, we look at 11 different energy technologies, 5 different types of jobs, and we have 529 different country level data points. And we cover a good part of the globe. Some areas you can see are missing, but we also do make sure to cover a lot of, basically all of the major energy producers that we could get data for. Next slide. And very quickly, just to give you a sense, this is what the World Induced Technical Change Hybrid Model is, or the WITCH model. We have policies, we put in various inputs around economy and population, and we have land use incorporated as well. We have sea level rise and other types of impacts incorporated, greenhouse gas air pollution, these kinds of things incorporated through other associated data sets and models. And we look specifically at the energy system and try to understand, as demand changes, what energy systems are being used to meet that demand with and without a constraint based on climate change. So if you go to the next slide. So what we feed in particular are something called the shared socioeconomic pathways. I'll explain those in a few minutes, but they're what give us assumptions around GDP and population, which gives us calculations around energy demand by region, and then energy supply by region. We have carbon budget and other constraints that we add in order to choose the least cost energy technologies based on capital costs, operating and maintenance costs, and fuel costs, which then tells us how many new installations we have, what the capacity changes are, what fuels are required in order to meet that demand. Go to the next slide. So we look at 2 scenarios and 6 pathways. The first is that all the countries that are part of the Paris Accord have nationally determined contributions. That is, this is what they say they're going to do, the policies that they currently have. And so the first set of scenarios are based on thinking about just extending those current policies. The second set of scenarios are based on a 1.5 degree or well below 2 degree climate target. In each case, we're looking at different imaginings of what the world might look like, which are called SSPs 1, 2, and 3, these shared socioeconomic pathways. SSP 1 is the sustainability pathway, taking the green road as low challenges to mitigation and adaptation. SSP 2 is a more middle of the road. And SSP 3 is based on a regional rivalry, what they call a rocky road, where there's high challenges to mitigation and adaptation. So in each of these cases, we're looking at differences in terms of trade and GDP and population and everything else that comes along with all those things that lead us to making it easier or harder in some senses to do mitigation and adaptation as we move forward. Okay, next slide. So what do we find? The first is good news. Climate mitigation means more energy jobs. 2020, we estimate there were about 17 million direct energy jobs, about 12 million of those in the fossil fuel industry, and the vast majority of those are in extracting fossil fuels. By 2050, if we just simply continue along with our current policy regimes, we'll be at about 21 million jobs. Now, a lot of that comes because we have growing population, growing demand, growing economies. So of course, we're going to have more jobs. But if we undertake strong climate change policies to get us to well below 2 degrees, the number of jobs actually go up. And that is in part because of changes in the job intensities of different types of energy systems, how many jobs it takes to actually produce the amount of energy that we need. And it's mixed up with a bunch of other things around efficiency and a few other things, of course, at the same time. The graphs that you're seeing are looking at jobs in 2020, jobs in 2050 for the reference scenario, and then jobs in 2050 for the well below 2 degrees scenario. The top set of graphs are for different energy technologies, the bottom set of graphs for different types of jobs. What you can see, for example, on the top set of graphs, that really bright yellow, that's solar PV, right, which grows quite a bit in terms of the jobs in 2050 for well below 2 degrees. On the bottom, the big change you see is that black, which is the extraction jobs. In 2020, you have all these extraction jobs, of course, in the fossil fuel industry, and those mostly go away or come very close to going away in 2050. If you go to the next slide. The other really interesting thing is, of course, climate mitigation results in more solar and wind, but that's not an extraction process, that's a manufacturing process. And what we find, of course, is that there's a large, big spike. What you're seeing here is the dashed lines are for well below 2 degrees. The solid lines are for the reference scenario. The colors refer to the different SSPs. But take a look at solar there for a moment. What you're seeing is this huge spike in manufacturing jobs in solar, particularly between 2030 and 2040 for the SSP3 and a little bit later for SSP1. And we don't know where those jobs are going to go. So what we've done is we've assigned them to a global pool. Basically, these are manufacturing jobs, millions of manufacturing jobs that are going to be up for grabs by different jurisdictions who could try to build up their domestic manufacturing industry around renewables. Next slide. We also see very big regional differences. China and the fossil fuel exporting regions are going to lose jobs under pretty much any scenario, but some regions will actually gain jobs. Interestingly, the Middle East, US might gain jobs. Southeast Asia, North Africa, Indonesia, Brazil, South Asia, India, Japan, and Korea all gain jobs. Some don't see very much of a difference. The European Union, Russia and the transition economies, Latin America. The left-hand graph is the reference scenario. The right-hand graph is the well below 2 degrees scenario. And the way to read these is that on the left hand, you have basically the influence simply of time and changes that are happening over time because of differences in, let's say, GDP and other changes. Whereas when you compare the left hand to the right hand, you see the impact of policy. So for example, you might look at Southeast Asia, which gains some jobs in the reference scenario, but gains a lot more jobs, and this is the top set of bars, gains a lot more jobs under the well below 2 degrees scenario. A country like Canada, where we are, Sandeep and I, which gains some jobs under the reference scenario, basically has a lot of those job gains wiped out a little bit under the well below 2 degrees scenario. Next slide, please. If we look at, for example, the United States, we see our current energy jobs in the United States, extractions at oil extractions, that big kind of purpley blob there sort of towards the middle. So we see construction jobs, extraction jobs, manufacturing jobs, not very many. Operations and maintenance jobs and some refinery jobs, but of course extraction is the big one. If we go to the next slide, we see a very big change. All of a sudden, solar PV construction, that yellow dot, that more prominent yellow dot is as big as the extractions job were before. The extractions jobs are going away. Operations and maintenance jobs are building up quite a bit because we're talking about more power plants and more operations and maintenance for those types of plants. Next slide. So great, people might care about having jobs, but they care about local jobs, right? Not all jobs. And there's been a big debate about and a big push to say, oh, well, there's more renewable energy jobs than there are fossil fuel jobs, and kind of showing that with an implied idea that these coal miners and coal power plant workers will just move into the renewables industry. So we asked a question, are local solar wind jobs a feasible option for coal miners in China, India, the US, and Australia? Next slide. So you can see some of that debate here, retraining investment for the US transition from coal to solar, wind project in Wyoming envisions coal miners as trainees. Next slide. So what we did in order to address this question is to look at the overlap between coal mines and renewable energies. And the things we find is that coal mines are not always suitable for solar and wind jobs. We basically have mapped out all the coal mining areas in these 4 countries with a 50-kilometer buffer, and then looked at which ones are in areas that are suitable for solar and wind based on the solar resource potential and the wind potential. And then used employment factors to calculate the capacity required to transition all these coal miners. Here, what you're looking at is China. All those nice blue dots, those are the coal mines. The shaded areas are where you have good solar, where you have solar potential, and where you really have the proper solar potential is those sort of reddish, yellow, brownish ones. That area in the green, where a lot of those coal mines are not great for solar, unfortunately. Moving on. You can see something similar here for all the 3 countries that we've looked at: Australia, the United States, India, where you see the dark purple is where it's suitable for both solar and wind. and the kind of peachy, pinky color is where it's suitable for solar, and the light blue is where it's suitable for just wind. And what you're seeing is that, for example, in the United States, a lot of the coal mining areas are over in the east, as well as the ones in Wyoming, but over in the east, and maybe suitable for some parts are suitable for solar, but a lot of parts are not suitable for either solar or wind. Look at Australia. Coal is on the east again, and suitable for solar, but definitely not suitable for wind. A similar story for India. So if you go on, please. So solar is actually more promising than wind for replacing coal mining jobs. And if we look at the United States, there's about 62% of the coal mining areas which are suitable for solar production, only 7% for wind. If we look at India and Australia, they're looking really good for solar. Almost 100% of the areas where coal mining is happening are suitable for solar energy potential, but only about 1% and 3% are suitable for wind. The problem is that even if that's true, when we look at those areas that are suitable for solar, for example, what we find is the amount of solar capacity required in order to absorb all those mining jobs is really, really high. So in those little buffers, you're having to build gigawatts of solar in each of those little buffers in order to absorb all those solar mining jobs. A very, very tall ask. So what are our take-home messages? So we can have some time to talk and through your questions, which is, oh, go back to this, thank you. Take-home messages. Just transition requires fossil fuel phase-outs to develop concrete plans in consultation with affected communities. There's a need to research just transitions in large fossil fuel producing countries such as China, India, the Middle East, Russia. Meeting the Paris climate goals will create more jobs than today, and renewable energy jobs could be an option for some fossil fuel workers, and they will be an option for lots of people. Some fossil fuel workers, not for all fossil fuel workers. And in particular, if we're talking about trying to keep those jobs local to the communities where those fossil fuel workers currently are. And next slide. So thank you very much. We look forward to your questions. Our Twitter handles are there. Our email addresses are there. Again, I want to thank Cassie and Johannes and Jessica, who have been amazing collaborators on this work. That's Johannes' team who runs that Witch model in Milan. And we are available for any questions. I went through some of those slides with some of those graphs a little bit fast in the interest of having time for questions. But if you want me to go back over any of that stuff, we certainly can. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Sandeep and Hisham, for sharing your thoughts with us. We do have a number of questions here, so let me try to go in the order that these have appeared. So the first question that I had was from Narayan Gobinathan, who's asking about the role of universal basic income to help with the people who might lose their fossil fuel jobs. So any thoughts on this one?
So I'll just jump in and say, I think that there's two ways of looking at this whole transition. One is in a very sort of technocratic way. It's replacing some technologies with other technologies, right? And in that sense, one could go back to the question of why do we even care, and it could just be this technocratic transition and those kinds of things. The other way of looking at this is to say, well, there's a just transition that needs to happen for all the reasons that Sandeep had justified. And so one policy among that just transition might be some form of universal basic income. But if we're talking universal basic income, we've now moved well beyond a just transition. So it gets to a whole other point around the Green New Deal and these other things, which says, is this just a technological change and we need to deal with these workers, or is there a deeper structural economic questions that this entire transition raises? That's where UBI might come in, I think. Because UBI just for coal workers would not make sense to me.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you. Next, I have Sushmita Jena, who's asking about BP's recent announcement to cut 10,000 jobs, which is about 15% of their workforce. So what is your thinking on what's going to happen with these large oil companies, both international and national oil companies, as part of this transition?
Sandeep, do you want to answer that, or I can take a crack at it? No, I think Sandeep might be frozen. Okay, I guess I'll take a crack. At it. All right. This is a really fascinating question, and one that I've been talking to people about and debating. So I'll say two things. One is we really need to think about forward thinking and planning for the transition, right? Because we can run headlong into a transition, and lots of people are going to have an issue. And I think in some senses, and Sandeep and I have talked about this, what we're seeing now with COVID-19 and the industry is a very compressed, hyper-compressed version of what might happen with a just transition, or with a transition, if we don't actually plan for it and plan for it to be just, right? The second thing I'll say is it's a really interesting thought experiment to think about, if we're talking 2050, which companies are still around in the energy sector? Have the big oil companies transitioned to doing something entirely different, right? Is it new companies that have come about? Are we moving away towards more public ownership, right? And so for a company like BP, one possible answer to that I've talked with a few people about is that, in fact, what we'll see is sections of those companies spinning off into this new energy economy, and other parts of those companies struggling to remain relevant in that new energy economy and maybe dying off. But so it's not necessarily all BP. There's a possibility in which these companies just simply fracture. Oh, and Sandeep is back. Sorry, Sandeep, I tried to pass it over to you, but you weren't there, so.
No, it's all great. I'll take the next one. It's
Okay.
I just got disconnected.
Okay, so I'll just note that we have something like 15 questions and 22 minutes, so we'll need to act quickly. So the next one is from Chris Gunn, who's asking about retraining oil and coal industry workers for local construction jobs in emerging economies as opposed to developed economies. So any thoughts on this one?
I mean, retraining is really a buzzword in this space, no doubt. What is interesting is that I have not seen a lot of evidence of how that will really play out, but retraining could be a possibility. Of course, you have to retrain. But one of the things about retraining programs in the past declines has been that these retraining efforts have not been geared towards new jobs that will come up. So we have to really think about this question, from which country and what new jobs are we talking about. I think it's really important to establish that a retraining effort should go hand in hand with job creation and access to those jobs. So that's my 2 cents on this.
Perfect. Thank you. The next question is from Zepora Berman, who's asking about your well below 2 degrees models. And the questions are, what are the assumptions about oil and gas production in those models? And what about carbon capture and storage and biomass carbon capture and storage?
Thank you. So the assumptions around oil and gas extraction. So you can see that extraction, I mean, there's still some extraction going on in 2050, right? Remembering that the goal is to hit net zero, but that does include things like carbon capture and storage, along with biomass. And you can see biomass coming into the model as well. So yes, it is in there. And we can argue as to whether or not, we should run a version of the model that doesn't have it, but that becomes harder and harder in some sense. But yes.
Excellent, thank you. Next we have Vijay Mangani, who's asking about integrated resource planning, and he notes that jobs and jobs losses are typically not included in integrated resource planning. So any thoughts on how jobs and economic value could be brought into these models?
Handle that, Sandeep, or you want me to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is true that it is not planned, and I could just agree with, yes, it should be included and it should be part of integrated planning. But I think that COVID will have some impact on that going forward, because many countries, politicians, people are talking about this. When they're rolling out industrial policies or thinking about industrial policies, they are talking about jobs. So I do think that we may see more of that going forward.
Yeah, I think I'd just add to that, it becomes a question of what's mandated as well, right? So there's a regulatory aspect of this in addition. So if the mandate in any utility, for example, in putting together an integrated resource plan is simply reliability and least cost, right? Then that's all they're mandated to do. That's all they're going to do, right? So there is a question of policy and regulation as well in terms of what their mandates are.
Excellent, thank you. And next I have Daljit Singh, who's asking about China's losing jobs. So what are your thoughts on, your model seems to imply that China is losing jobs, but China is currently a major solar manufacturing hub. So any thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that China has a huge mining industry jobs. And we only know that there is, if I have to go back and look at the numbers, but they have something like 5 million or something like that coal mining jobs alone. And this is direct jobs we are talking about. So when you include indirect, induced, and so on. And you see, and Johannes, in your own work and others, you have seen that China is still building power plants for this region, for this reason, because for local economies, these jobs and local revenues are so important. So I do think that it has implications. And I mean, not that they have read our report, and not that I mean, they know that these jobs are important for those regions. So they are even today they're building these plants and mines.
I think the other thing to point there is that that there is that global pool of jobs, which China will be competitive for already because it already has a big manufacturing base, right? But we did not want to make the assumption that all solar manufacturing jobs are going to just stay in China, right? Over the next few decades. So there is a chance for China to mitigate some of those job losses by continuing to be very competitive in the solar manufacturing world.
Got it. So we are clearing questions, but more up here. So it's a good problem to have, but it's a problem nonetheless. So we'll try to get through as many as we can. Setu Peltz is asking two very interesting questions. One is sort of what is a rough share in Indian states in the coal belt, so Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and so on? Like how much of the total employment is coal related? Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, what about the current employment in the renewable energy sector? Any rough guidelines?
Okay, so I'll start with the coal sector. I mean, like I said, if you look at just the coal industry and direct jobs, it's almost 6.6 million people are employed, but that really is a very small share when you look at indirect and induced jobs. And I mean, if you go to some of the districts like Dhanbad and Ramgarh, there's nothing else but coal mining. Like it is a major employer. Everybody is tied to those industries. So I think it's really important for regional jobs. In terms of renewable jobs, the other interesting thing is that most of the renewable energy development in India is happening in the west and the south of India. So it's a complete mismatch between areas where coal is going to decline versus renewables are going to rise, both from a manufacturing point of view and also from the utility scale and other kinds of solar and wind installations. So that's
perfect. Thank you. Next, I'm going to take, I have a question from Paulo Prunzel, who's asking about sort of regulation. So is there any regulation in India that fossil fuel companies would have to spend some percentage of their profit or revenue in low carbon technology, R&D investment, and all that?
Well, there used to be something called clean coal cess. They have, after the GST, goods and services tax and other things were introduced, there has been some reshuffle in this area. I have to look into the details. I have not looked at it, but there used to be this fund that based on coal production, you would pay a certain amount of money, which would go to this clean energy fund, and that was supposed to foster low carbon transitions. But that's still happening, but a mechanism is a bit different.
Got it. So next I have Sean Maddox, who's asking about strategies for, again, helping these workers. So besides relocation, what are some other strategies? What can we do kind of on site in the places where we have currently the fossil fuel resources?
I'll just say, I think that relocation, let me just say one thing about relocation and labor mobility. I think that there are probably a huge variety of opinions on the ability of workers to relocate. And so I think you see a very big difference. For example, in the UK, after the coal decline, a lot of people did not move, right? On the other hand, the oil sands in Alberta has lots of people who've come to work there from other parts of Canada, right? So labor migration is going to look very, very different depending where you are. But but the problem is a lot of models would just assume some form of labor migration, which I think is wrong. And so I think what really needs to happen is that first part that Cindy was talking about, which is the planning part, right? What is the nature of the economy going to look like in this area over time, and how do we plan for that? And maybe some of it that's renewables jobs, but maybe that's something it's a different set of industries, right? And that's going to determine that labor migration piece of it, as well as the degree, as well as all kinds of things like age structure, right? Younger workers, older workers, for example, might look very differently at labor migration issues.
Perfect. Next, I have an interesting question from Kania Kali from South Africa. So she notes that based on your slides, the situation doesn't look great in South Africa, where the sort of potential for replacing coal industry jobs is very limited. So what should a country like South Africa or Africa more broadly do with just transition, given kind of rich fossil fuel resources and some of these challenges?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, well, I do note that there is a lot of people I know that they're working on South Africa in terms of this. Again, I would go back to my first point about like this long-term planning. Right now, all the proposals in academic literature and otherwise, there's a lot of policy literature as well on this topic, are really focused on 1:1 replacement. I think the need is to look at an integrated planning, and look at what are the variety of options available. And that's one of our big recommendations, that let's stop focusing only on renewable jobs and let's start looking at variety of jobs. Can mining jobs be an option? Can chemical industries be an option? Can other types of industries be an option, both local and nationally? And so I think it's really important, again, depending on the country and context, you start thinking about it but you will start thinking about it when people and politicians will recognize the recognize the importance of moving away from fossil fuels. So yeah.
Let me add two things. Again, I'll bring up the global pool of jobs, right? So this is a place where countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, could develop industrial policy that would make them competitive for that global pool of manufacturing jobs. The second thing I'll note is when we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa, and the other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, we can't divorce this from a conversation around climate justice and a question of who's transitioning when and how fast, and the issue around the fact that the climate problem has really originated not in those places, right? And so I don't want to get into a big debate around it right now, but I do feel like we do need to put that flag down to say there is a climate justice question here as well that we need to address when we're thinking about this jobs transition, this fossil fuels transition.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Next, I have two questions from Anjali Sharma. So she's asking, first, how certain are you of the overall trends related to global employment under this sort of Paris Agreement targets, considering that all the indirect induced jobs, all that? And then the second question is on the location of the manufacturing jobs, specifically in slide 35. So what is the reason why the location is uncertain?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Sandy.
So to answer the first question about jobs, this one thing I want to make it very clear that this study only focuses on direct jobs. That is very important. So we do not look at indirect and induced jobs. If we look at indirect jobs in countries like India, direct jobs is a very small share of total coal mining employment. So this is only focused on direct jobs. So that is the first thing. Having said that, since we collect this large data set from original sources, we're quite certain about the current numbers. And based on all the assumptions and the different modeling projections, we are and we do sensitivity analysis around 3 socioeconomic pathways. So we are in that sense quite certain about the future numbers. Again, want to emphasize, this is not a prediction. This is a what if question that integrated assessment models typically deploy and use. And the last question was about
global pool. No, go ahead. Sure.
Oh, on the question of global pool, because this is going to play out over 2 decades. And if you think post-COVID, I mean, whether you like it or not, many countries, including India, like there is all this talk about domestic, we need to promote domestic manufacturing of solar and wind. So we can't really say where these industries will go. Like in the early 2000s, Germany was dominating the manufacturing of solar and wind equipment, but then China took over in the late. So it's hard to predict where this will go, and this is a great opportunity for country to attract investment.
Yeah, and unlike the other parts of the energy system, there is no reason for it to be tied to a particular geography, right? Coal mining has to be tied to where the coal is. Solar PV production, in terms of the energy production as electricity, is tied to where the good solar is. Manufacturing can, in theory, happen anywhere, right? So it's one part of this entire chain, which is actually quite transportable anywhere in the world.
Okay, that's very good. I think it's a nice way to think about it. Next, I have Keith Lima is asking about energy storage. So do you think the storage industry in the United States and elsewhere could play a big role in creating some of these new jobs? Any thoughts on this one?
So we do not include, we thought about it, but we could not find country level data on this energy storage. We had these conversations, and we make that very clear in our assumptions that we do not account for energy storage jobs. So I personally don't know what is the scale of, operations and maintenance jobs that would come with energy storage.
Okay, so next question is from Mary Kavanagh, and she's asking about, so what do you think about the European Green New Deal plans? Will this have a big impact on energy transition and all that?
Ready?
So I mean, I have not read into details about the European Green New Deal, but one thing I note in that is that they also have upped their Just Transition Fund from 7.5 billion to 40 billion. So within the European Union, I think there is more and more recognition of the topic, and they are sort of going in this direction. But I cannot comment on the details of the Green New Deal in the EU.
Okay, so another question from Justin Fisher. So he's asking about, so what is your thinking about this level of attention to just transition in some of these major coal countries like China and India in particular? Is there enough discussion? If there isn't, why? What sort of?
So this is a great question. So I can comment on India with some confidence. So in India, while the renewables are now, rising, no doubt, and the central government and many state governments are really supportive of this, nobody is talking about demise of coal. It's one thing for renewables to rise, but market can do it. That's a different thing. But no, I don't think any politicians on the right will say that shut down coal mines and power plants. That's a completely different topic. So since that debate has not started, which might happen in 5 years when actually the market will force some power plants, at least in the beginning, and then maybe subsequently mines, to shut down, maybe when that starts, then maybe this debate will start. Although in the policy, in the academic and sort of the think tank space, this debate is slowly penetrating.
I think you also have to recognize that this is being done. It is in the context of growing energy demand, right? So it's a very different situation where in some senses energy demand starts been plateauing or even declining in a few places, in sort of, let's say, in Europe and North America, whereas in India and China we're looking at economies that are growing and a population that is large part of the population which is very low income, which is demanding more and more energy services to meet their needs. And so it's the entire energy climate debate has to, of course, be then somewhat different as well.
Great. So we are almost at the end of our time, but there's two more questions I want to cover. If I can get like super brief responses to this. The first one is from Dennis Nederitu, who was asking a very interesting question on automatization. So to what extent do you think this sort of other trend that is really killing a lot of jobs, and maybe also creating some of them, is that going to sort of complicate this process? Is it going to influence energy jobs? What's your thinking on this one?
Yeah, automation's interesting. I think it's a big unknown. I think that automation might affect, in particular, the manufacturing side that we've been talking about. So that global pool may not be as big as we might think, but it's really hard to estimate. Whereas I'm not sure that it's going to affect O&M type jobs as much. I'm not sure it's going to affect construction jobs as much, which are the big jobs also in renewables that come up. So I think it's not going to be widespread as an issue across the sector, but it's going to be definitely in some parts where it's going to be a big issue. It's hard to estimate what that's going to look like.
Perfect. And final question is from Marta Talevi from LSE. So she's asking about sort of, does just transition require investments in sectors like education, urban planning, infrastructure that often produce sort of results in the long run? Is that necessary? And if yes, like what can we do about that?
So, I mean, those are actually some of our elements, especially education, that we have seen in hard coal mining decline in Germany, that, you know, the governments have invested a lot of money in starting institutions and education, you know, colleges and schools that have really helped transition from a coal-based economy to a knowledge-based economy. And it is also a question of, you know, local governance. So whether if this is a town or a village, so in that sense, it's really important to also think about who will continue to fund, you know, infrastructure projects that right now in some cases are funded by, say, coal companies or oil companies. So yes, that's
Perfect.
my short answer.
So we are at the end of our time. So I'll again thank Hisham and Sandeep for a terrific presentation, a great discussion, lots of exciting questions. Learned a lot myself, so thanks for this opportunity. And again, for the audience, you will receive the recording and the slides in email after this. If you're interested in learning more about our work, attending some of our future webinars, we have another one on kind of energy politics in the United States with Professor Leah Stokes next week. So please check out our website, size-isep.org. And with that, I'll close today's session and wish everybody a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
And thank you all for the participants and their great questions.